to reflect a more Greek perspective of the story of the Messiah. That's the point. And we had talked about it, and that's a part of the supersessionist thinking, the replacement theology thinking, if you will. So we were going to discuss supersessionism, which took an awful long time to get here, but I'm glad we're even talking about it at this point. So for those viewers who may not know what supersessionism, basically it is, I will take from you and give it to some who will bring the fruits to labor. That's the scriptural justification for it, but basically...
my computer, if I may, because I'll just give you the definition that R. Kendall Sulan gives.
Okay. Basically, it's the claim that everything that was for the Jews is now for the Greek church. We are Israel. We are the new Israel. That would be the claim.
So the word supersedere is the Latin for to sit above or to be superior to, but then it comes to mean to replace or set aside. And supersessionism can be defined as the traditional Christian belief that the church has taken the place of the Jewish people and that God's covenant with the Jewish people is now over and done with. And that means that not only are the Jewish people replaced, but the Jewish, the law and the covenant that God made with the Jewish people have been abrogated, they've been set aside, or they've been made obsolete. And in fact, many theologians, such as Thomas Aquinas, would say that continuing to practice Jewish law is actually mortifera, death-bearing. So it's a very strong distinction between the old covenant, the old people of God, the old law, and the new covenant, the new people of God, the church, that replaces Israel. Now, the key book on this to read is by R. Kendall Sulan, who's a Methodist theologian, and his book is called The God of Israel and Christian Theology. It's a complex book because it looks at examples throughout the history of the Christian church, from the Epistle of Barnabas, Melito of Sardis, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Kant, Schleiermacher and Harnack. He goes through the whole history of Christian interpretation of the Bible with the view that God has replaced, I'm using the word replacement here, God has replaced Israel by the church. And especially Augustine then has an argument that while God has replaced the old people of God with the new people of God, the church, nevertheless God has preserved the Jewish people to be what he calls reluctant witnesses to the truth of Christianity. The Jews rejected Jesus, they deserve to be punished. They're punished by being exiled, they're condemned to wander the earth. Maybe when Jesus returns, they will be restored in the last days, because the last shall be first and the first shall be last. But they're basically preserved as reluctant witnesses to the truth of Christianity. Now, what Sulan says...
I think that's the light version.
The light version.
There are many harsher things been said.
Exactly, and I'm going to just describe the three types of supersessionism and then come on to post-supersessionism.
Okay.
So Kendall Sulan in his book says there's what's called punitive supersessionism, that Israel is to be punished for her rejection of Jesus. And this means that not only is she no longer God's people because the church are God's people, but because the Jews killed Christ,
right,
the Jews deserve to be punished.
Which is considered deicide, for which there is no expiation possible.
Yes, although the argument would be, because Luther makes this argument many times in his book on the Jews and their lies, that the Jews are condemned to wander the earth for 1,500 years. They will never return to their land. And of course, the Jewish people now have returned to their land. So the argument...
But they did wander for the prescribed 1,500 years.
But think how shocked, I mean, if you read my book on Luther and the Jews, think how shocked Luther was that these Jews who deserved to be punished for rejecting Jesus, and he's an Augustinian,
Yes.
so he's following Augustine's teaching, are actually now forgiven because they're back in their land. So that's punitive supersessionism, which is basically Christian anti-Judaism, which we would now call
Yes,
anti-Semitism.
and it has gone a lot deeper, and to the point that John Chrysostom made the statement that God always hated the Jews.
Yeah.
And it is our job as Christians to hate the Jews.
Yeah.
They should be eliminated as defective animals.
Yes, and he goes further than Augustine or Luther by saying they should be put to death.
Yes,
Luther
he
says they
does.
should be kept alive.
He said they are marked for being culled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's the first type. That's not the worst type of supersessionism. The second type is what Sudan calls economic supersessionism. In the oikonomia, the economy of God, the divine plan of God, Israel is no longer needed in God's purpose, and therefore there is no longer any continuing theological significance to the Jewish people outside the church. In other words, it's like the stages of a rocket taking off and leaving the Earth's orbit. Once you get out of the Earth's orbit, you jettison the first stage. Now, I'm a Messianic Jew, a Jewish disciple of Yeshua, and you could say that I'm part of that remnant because I'm fully Jewish and I'm fully a disciple of Yeshua as much as I can be. I think when you call yourself a disciple, you realise how much you have left to learn and how
true.
poor a disciple
We
you
would
are.
hope you would realize that.
Yeah, and that's why I don't use the term Messianic Jew so much, because it's almost a pride thing. But economic supersessionism would say, okay, Richard, you're one of the few who's the remnant. You've been preserved, but God's finished with the rest of them.
Right. Once the reality has arrived, the model of which Israel was, the model is no longer needed.
Yeah.
It's the blueprints are done
Exactly.
away with because we have the reality now.
The prototype is what, and Sunan says that the standard model of interpreting the Bible drives a historical wedge between the gospel and the God of Israel by collapsing God's covenant with Israel into the economy of redemption in its pre-figurative form.
Yes.
So all that Israel was there to do was to prefigure the coming of the Messiah. But Sunan says the worst or the most serious type of supersessionism is not punitive or economic, but what he calls structural supersessionism. The way that we structure the biblical narrative, or some people might say meta-narrative, the Christian reading of the biblical canonical narrative goes from the creation and fall to redemption and consummation, omitting the election of Israel as the blessing to all the nations. Now, if you lose that third stage, you just have a four-step creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. You lose the election of Israel as really a structuring device for the telling of the whole of the Bible's story. So if the election of Abraham and the call of Israel is to be a means of blessing for the nations, you have what Sulan calls a mutuality of blessing. Israel exists to bless the nations exist to bless Israel. Although, of course, because of the fall, because of the curse, because of the divisions of the nations, it's not much of a blessing. Israel is normally judged or persecuted by the nations. The nations are normally ignored by Israel. Although the very purpose of Israel is to demonstrate God's character through his Torah. And again, one of the problems with supersessionism is that if you lose the election of Israel and you lose the divine giving of the Torah as a means of salvation and redemption, and you say law bad, grace good, you've lost the way that the Bible narrative should be correctly interpreted.
It is analogous to saying, as we talked about, Hebrew good, Greek bad, when you're referring to the scriptures and the religious writings, which I don't agree with at all. But what you're talking about, you're verbalizing, I think, is very much what I'm saying in the Sons of Zion, that everything we know about our Hebrew Messiah, we see through the Greek filter of another language, culture, and thought. It's a structural thing. And so we come to see Yeshua dressed up as a Greek philosopher, so to speak. And he thinks in Greek terms, and he acts in Greek terms, and his thoughts are in Greek terms. And if you want to get close to who the Savior really was, you need to get down to the Hebrew level.
Now, I think you're coming at this, I think we're coming towards the same thing, but I think you're coming from a different place and you're using different tools. So I think your methodology is linguistic.
Yes.
And I would say it's a sort of branch of discourse analysis and sociolinguistics.
Textual criticism?
Yeah, but your textual criticism has got a heavy weight of interpretive activity going on. You're really doing theology.
I think that could be really characterizing the whole field of textual criticism. I
wouldn't agree.
I am guilty.
Yeah, no,
as
I
well.
would say that textual criticism in its highest form is ideologically neutral. Now, you may disagree with that.
No, I don't disagree with that.
Oh, okay.
I just don't think in practice you see much of that. I think you see more things like the Markan priority, which says Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke were taken from Mark, when obviously that's an emperor has no clothes argument.
Yeah, I think where you mean, you and I mean different things by textual criticism. Mm-hmm. And I think you're talking about tradition criticism and authorial intentions and authorial identification. When I'm talking textual criticism, I'm simply meaning texts and manuscripts.
Well, in the methodology I use has two sides to the coin. One is the internal evidence of the text, which is really important, but the other is the historical context of the text. Yeah. So that in that any evidence there is outside of the text itself, they have to. You have to look at two sides of the coin.
Yeah, I would call that. I mean, okay, so we're using terms,
and that would include a lot of the interpretation you're calling.
Yeah.
You're talking
well,
about.
I would say that's part of the discipline of hermeneutics and biblical interpretation. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to do my theology through a literary critical vehicle. I'm trying to do my theology through historical and systematic theology.
All right. I'm struggling to follow this, okay? You're calling mine a literary, critical methodology.
I'm saying that you're drawing theological conclusions from a literary critical approach based on a view of translations, translation theory. You're saying that in the act of translation, key theological errors have been made.
Yes. Purposefully. I'm saying that they've been made purposefully.
Yes. I've never accepted that as a view. I mean, Britain and America, the English and the Americans are divided by a common language, said Winston Churchill.
Yes, he did.
And I'm fully happy to say that when you ask for a glass of water and I ask for a glass of water, we're using different forms of the same language. But I thought about this in my PhD methodology. I said, what is the best method to use?
I wish you had done it on Luke.
Yeah, well, no, I wish Luke's an ongoing project. By the way, my master's dissertation was on a medieval manual of apologetics called the Pugio Fidei, the Dagger of Faith.
Yes.
And the Dagger of
Raymond
Faith...
Marti.
Raymondus Martini. Mm-hmm. Sounds like a drink. and I'm one of the few people that has really done the literature on this. And Martini is the high watermark of medieval apologetics, and many of these quotations that you're referring to are compiled by him and his assistants.
He's one of the writers who attests to the survival of the Hebrew Gospels into medieval times in Spain.
He pulled everything together. Nobody has done better than him. So I'm very much at home with the medieval materials, but I think the method that you're using is not, I mean, I'm very argumentative, as you can tell.
I've noticed.
But I would say that
wouldn't be much of a debate without it.
The right method to critique Greek and Hebraic thought is not primarily through linguistic analysis, or especially through study of translation, although that obviously helps. But it's a broader discourse than that.
Well, I agree. I agree it's a broader discourse. We may differ on what avenues that discourse takes, but I'm very firmly, because I get into a lot of history in my books, very firmly you have to understand the context of history. The Bible did not exist in a vacuum, and if it was an accurate history, then history should reflect that, should connect to that, and the means of connection, they can be very important.
But it sounds to me that you're not really being historical.
We haven't read the book yet, so you might actually come to think differently about that.
Well, the reason I say this is because I do also talk about historiography, about the writing of history, and the method of doing history. And it sounds to me like you've got a basic theory that you're pursuing. And I want a more self-critical judgment on your methodology here. I want to hear the counter-arguments put by you and addressed by you. Now, my Messianic friends will tell you that Richard Harvey never makes up his mind. He always sees good here and bad here, and then when you say, what do you think? He says, well, it's in my next book. So I'm guilty as well. Right.
Well, I think I spent a lot of time putting the arguments of the other side, because it is the mainstream position, many of these counter arguments to what I am proposing in my book. So you can't ignore them.
Yeah.
And I've seen authors that do try and ignore that. You can't really, in my viewpoint, you can't do it. Right. You have to know what is taken as an orthodox view of biblical ideas or historical events. And if you've got evidence to prove otherwise, you present it, but you don't. Yeah. You don't act like this is the way it is because I say it is. No. Well, this is what the mainstream, I'm going against the mainstream, and here's my evidence for doing so.
I will read your book carefully, and I will critique it at 3 levels. One is the linguistic translation level. I know a little bit about Greek and a little bit about Hebrew, and I will read it carefully.
Good.
The second is the hermeneutical theory. The way that you are looking at the theory of interpretation and how you connect the translation issues with the theological ideas. The third area, I will look at it, is on the theological framing of the whole argument.
Right.
At the moment, I'm seeing it as a dualistic, essentialist argument. Jewish good, Greek bad.
Well, I actually mentioned that in the introduction to the book. The thesis of this book is not Hebrew good, Greek bad, because both cultures have had incredibly noble moments in their history, and both cultures have had incredibly ignoble moments in their history. It is about truth, as best I have been able to pierce it and present it. And if it isn't, then please tell me so, and I will do my best to.
Well, God bless you, because I know that I need to do my homework now. So if you, a good friend of mine once said, we will now do you the honour of criticising you.
Well, I feel
So
that way
if
about
you're-
criticism, especially
Yeah.
with someone as knowledgeable as you are. But yes, the whole book does have a certain theme that we've got this dynamic of the two most literate cultures in the ancient world, the Hebrews and the Greeks, and they are woven like strands of DNA. And all through history, we've got this dynamic going, and it is this framework that defines a lot of our knowledge of the scripture.
Absolutely.
You know, because history is what happened.
Yeah.
Our writing about it is sometimes our best guess.
Well, I would say that history is both what happened and the way we tell the story of what happened. So I do not separate the events from the significance we put to the events.
Well, when you're critiquing as to whether something did actually happen, you have to separate them. You have to say, well, yes, we have this perception of it happened, but all the evidence shows it was another thing. History, as we write it in history books, with our titles after it and everything, very authoritative. You know, you have
I
to
think
believe this on
most
authority.
historians
It's
would
our
not-
best guess
No,
is
no,
what
most
happened.
historians, if they really looked at their own methodology, would say that yes, we base ourselves on a philosophy of critical realism, but they wouldn't say it quite as blankly as that there's the events and then there's the value we put on the events. There's always a subjectivity to the way that we interpret what may or may not have happened.
That was a quotation. I think it was from C.W. Sarum, but it was basically that history is what happened, and our history books are our best guess as to what happened. And I do challenge that because, you know, historians may well think they're historical realists, but the chronology problem is very essential in understanding the Bible and the reality and the truth of it, because that today's even biblical archaeologists and historians say the Bible is not an accurate record of history, and in particular on the Exodus, they have moved the Exodus up 200 years later than the biblical timeline of it. Then they've done this by misinterpreting two verses in Scripture, and then they say, and if you look at the evidence on the ground, there is no evidence of the conquest of any Canaanites or Hebrews in Egypt. None of it happened. But of course, it's a circular argument, right? Because they pulled
you're
it.
coming from what I would call a very conservative stream of an evangelical reading of Scripture, and you're using to harness your theological payload an engine of a certain type of historical activity. I come from a different stream.
Please explain, because
Well,
what I'm describing is
quoting
pretty
myself.
much is pretty much the mainstream position on the Exodus.
No, it's not the main. Well, it is in America or in Texas. It's not here in Europe. I think I'm more able to accurately reflect the theological climate of European, and not just the theological climate. It's really the historical and the philosophical climate.
Well, frankly, I'd be really delighted if that were so.
Well, I would say read the first 100 pages of N.T. Wright's Jesus and the Victory of God, and you'll hear how he, claiming to be a historian, justifies his historiographical approach through the philosophy of what he calls critical realism. Now, I don't agree with N.T. Wright on his conclusions.
When did he write this?
About 10 years ago.
N.T. Wright, and the title is?
Jesus and the Victory of God.
Check up.
Now, I would say that N.T. Wright, and I'm saying I don't agree with him, is probably the snapshot of contemporary New Testament studies for the past 20 or 30 years. And you will enjoy reading that first 100 pages. You will laugh, you will cry, you will argue, you will not be persuaded, but it will make you think.
Well, that would be great. And perhaps I've gotten fossilized, but I do know what the mainstream views on the history of the Exodus are. And they're pretty...
Well,
it's
I
not that
think
there are
most-
not people that,
No.
it's not that everyone agrees, but it is the mainstream position, and it prevents such things as, okay, the jury is in on the Exodus as happening 2 centuries after it actually happened, and we're not going to consider any other evidence because the jury is in.
No, it doesn't work like that. I mean, I teach Old Testament theology as a third-year course. My first-year course is a survey of Old Testament, and we do the history and the literature of the Old Testament. And one of the standard essay questions is, did the Exodus happen in 1440 or 1220? Give your arguments and come to a conclusion.
I would say you're not typical.
I'm typical of British biblical studies.
Well,
And
if you say so, I would be loath to disagree.
Well,
but
I'm representing a whole academic community. These are conservative, evangelical, spirit-filled, charismatic missionaries. But we are part of the Open University, which is the largest worldwide accreditor of university degrees. And as the Open University, we'd be comparable to Cambridge or Oxford or any other university. All I'm doing is teaching from the standard textbooks, and I'm saying, of course, some people don't think it ever happened. Other people, I mean, in fact, most evangelical Christians in this country would argue for a late date, for a late date, 1220.
yes,
Because they follow John Bimpson, who is a conservative scholar teaching in Trinity College, Bristol, Evangelical Anglican College.
Right.
Now, in your side of the pond, and certainly in your
well, I've
area,
studied Bimpson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a friend of mine. His wife is a Jewish believer in Jesus.
Really? We, for our listeners, we're talking with Dr. Richard S. Harvey, who is one of the leading experts on these topics we're talking about.
I know only about Messianic Jews.
Well,
I've had to teach all these.
Messianic Judaism was his doctorate, and that's what we are discussing. We're glad to have such a distinguished colleague here, and we're taking an intermission.
Yeah.